Okay, does everybody have your sheet out with your ask? Remember the one I asked you to take out earlier? Get it visible, because I'm going to make you read it together. Okay, it looks like this. It's on what looks like letterhead. It's got the names of the organizations down the left side of the page. Okay, if enough of you got it that we can listen to each other say it. Starting with the Our Nation. Together. Our nation can and must do more to nurture a culture of peace. We call for U.S. policies that reduce acquisition and use of guns for purposes that cause harm, to rebalance funding priorities away from outsized military spending to focus more resources on preventing violence and enhancing human security. Okay, I'm asking Brian Miller and Ara, I'm stumbling on it, Kanagas, to come up and each give just about a minute or two on each of the pieces, the two big pieces, and then I'll come back up here and just monitor the people running around with microphones.
Okay, we all read, our nation can and must do more to nurture a culture of peace. We call for U.S. policies that reduce acquisition and use of guns for purposes that cause harm. And many of you heard us yesterday, and I think we got a positive response, a really positive response. So I hope you're all with us on this, and tomorrow we'll talk to legislators about this, because they need to hear from you. And the legislation that we hope you've discussed does the following. Close loopholes in gun sales and trafficking laws, limit the ammunition capacity and public sale of semi-automatic firearms with detachable magazines. These are assault weapons, basically, and the ammunition that powers them. Limit acquisition of guns by persons with a documented history of violence or diagnosed with severe mental illnesses and demonstrated violent behavior. Collect data on the number of deaths and injuries by guns in the U.S., whether accident, suicide, or violent intent. This is critical. The NRA works really hard to keep information from the American public. It's critical. You can't convince legislators of things unless you can show them numbers in many cases. Mandate keeping guns secured in lockboxes, safes, or the like, and support evidence-based nonviolent methods for prevention and intervention in youth violence, namely the Youth Promise Act. So those are all critical things, and I'm glad to answer any questions when the time comes. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Ora Kanagas again with the American Friends Service Committee. I have the easy job of suggesting that perhaps these are not your priorities. The red in this chart is the amount of the discretionary budget, and that's an important piece of information, the money that Congress has authority to allocate every year and makes choices about every year. The red part is what they chose to spend on the military. That leaves the remaining, it varies by a few percentage points a year, for everything else you care about. So the simplest version of the message for the Hill tomorrow is this does not reflect my priorities, the priorities of my faith, the priorities of my congregation, the needs of our community, and the things that make us feel secure. So the wonky version of that message, and if you would like some of these handy-dandy strips of your own, we have some new ones coming out, so I'm hot to get rid of the old ones, and they're all in the back of the room. They look like this. Yeah. As I said, it varies by a few percentage points a year, but essentially the message is the same about the proportion. So our asks are reduce the budget allocation for the Pentagon and increase funding for deeply underfunded aspects of human security, that's in the U.S. and abroad, including investments in education, healthcare, sustainable jobs with living wages, eliminating hunger and extreme poverty, clean energy, and policies that help those most in need to build assets. And you don't need to necessarily use those wonky words. You can use the thing in your community that speaks most to your heart. There is not enough money for schools because we've made a different choice. There is not money for healthcare because we have made a different choice. And as my representative, I would like you to help us change that set of priorities in Washington. Eliminating the use of budget gimmicks. You may hear in the news that the Pentagon is really being squeezed very, very badly. One of the fancy things that happens with the Pentagon budget is people speak about it as a cut if it is a reduction from their wishes. So, while I might wish that my salary would triple next year, I did not get a pay cut when my pay only goes up by 3%. The Pentagon doesn't view it that way. If they wanted their increase to be this much, and it is only this much, that's spoken of as a cut. So remember that as you hear how drastic the cuts have been for the military. Yes, in the period from before 9/11, so not just because of 9/11, from like 1998 or 99 until 2011, the Pentagon budget doubled. That's not just for like one-time war funding. The budget doubled. So think about any other area of federal spending that you are acquainted with where that happened. I don't know of many. Any that I care about. Cleaning up Pentagon contracting. We have a lot of concern about good government. People are really concerned about reducing the federal budget, but this part of the budget not subject to audit. Not only not subject to audit, unauditable. They say. Everything else has to account for things down to the penny. So you might want to speak to your member about that imbalance. At the same time we're addressing what we are spending on, we need to also address what we're not spending money on that we should be in terms of prevention and addressing conflict with other tools. Increasing funding for the Complex Crisis Fund. That provides flexible funding to enable USAID and the State Department to undertake rapid stabilization, prevention, and crisis response activities. When we see something brewing, we don't have to sit back and wait until a crisis breaks out and then send airstrikes that won't do anything to fix the situation. Increase funding for conflict and stabilization operations. So again, focusing on preventing deadly conflict by assessing and planning an effective response to countries that are struggling with or at risk from protracted conflict. So those are the key components of our ask. And there are some points with a lot of wonky information, but you don't have to become an expert in the F-35, and you don't have to become an expert in overseas contingency operations. You may if you would like to, but mostly you just need to know this and speak from your heart.
That last part about not needing to be wonky and learn all of this stuff and speak from your heart is really critical. We have these other things on here that might give you some tips that you might choose one or two of those things that you might want to use as examples on your visit. Nobody is going to talk about everything that's in this paper. Got it? You pick, as you're looking through it, what hits your heart? What really captures you that you're like, I don't want this to happen, or I do want this to happen, and speak to that from your heart. Okay, are we ready to ask questions? Do we have two people with mics? Is there another person with a mic walking around? Can we get another person with a mic walking around? Thank you. Thanks, Eli. But Eli has to be ready to answer questions, too.
Eli, Why don't we leave that one for the panelists? And I'll just.
Maybe, okay, we're going to only have one mic going around. Okay.
Hi, my name is Heather Stetcher, and the question that I have is currently before the Senate Intelligence Committee, there is a decision impending on the release of a 6,000-page report on the CIA and the torture which they have inflicted, which was authorized by the highest levels of the U.S. government. That decision, I was told by several Senate staff members, is imminent within the next 2 weeks. This is an urgent issue, and yet we are not supposed to ask for it, for our members to vote in the affirmative when we meet with them tomorrow. I think that is a huge loss.
My response to that would be, when you're in that office, ask if you could speak to the appropriate person, because the person you'll have an appointment with is not likely to be someone who can do something about that. So what you would ask for is to talk with someone who works with intelligence, with foreign.
Can I just follow up very briefly? My point is that it should have been on that sheet. It is an imminent danger that we should all be talking to our appropriate members about.
Margie, I wonder if it might be helpful to introduce the other panelists up here in case people want to direct questions to them.
Okay. Okay, Eli is here to potentially answer questions, and Marty Shupak.
So if there's questions about particularly the Youth Promise Act and some of the aspects of
would be Eli
restorative
McCarthy.
justice, it would be Eli, and then Marty Shupak can particularly speak to how we, as we reduce some of the funding to the Pentagon, how some of that money might be diverted toward poverty-focused development aid. So those are some of the other experts that are up here to ask questions
Okay, there's a
of.
question way back in the back, and he was waving earlier.
Yes, hello. Nathan Rich from Maryland. And my question has to do with the ask about rebalancing funding for priorities on military spending. I noticed that there is no specific legislation mentioned. And so my question is, how do we, in our follow-up, see whether they have accomplished what we're asking?
Yeah.
So there are two basic functions within Congress, and one is authorizing legislation. So that's language to say what we should do, and then appropriating language, which says what we should spend. So every year there is a federal budget process, and so that's going on right now. And in the ask, you can make a note. We could have said, and maybe you might want to say, for the current budget process for fiscal year 15 that is underway, we'd like to see a greater shift in the appropriations process to shift more funding toward human needs, and that in the messaging about the Pentagon's needs, in the messaging about where cuts need to come from, that your member of Congress be a source of truth-telling about that imbalance. So there are a couple of very wonky levers for shifting pots of money, and I think our judgment was, rather than try to get you into wonky levers, to sort of speak about the marathon rather than the little sprints of this year, that balance needs to change, and that you'd like to see your member voting for amendments that shift funds from military spending to other areas.
Okay. Okay, there's another one standing there. And then I'm going to make you move over to the other side. So.
Hi, my name's Steve Harrow. I'm from Wisconsin's 8th District. I'm looking at the final paragraph on page 1. It lists about 9 or 10 different bills, mostly House, a few Senate ones. Is this to say that all of these bills in this final paragraph are still on the floor? Do some have more traction than others? And I'll leave my question at that.
They are active this session, which goes to the end of December. How active they might be is going to vary. They are ones that can be, that you could say, hey, push this thing, push this thing. They're actually, this is only a small number. There are over 50 active bills related to gun violence and to this area. We just put down a few that are highlighting the kinds of things we highlighted here.
Okay, so this is my first time here, and thank you for putting this together. Regarding the budget and the fact that they don't do audits, what can I expect is their reasoning for why they get accepted from doing an audit? And is there any response to that?
That's a wonderful question to ask them. We ask that every once in a while, and we push very hard. It's too complicated. And they also say that some of it is a matter of national security. That's kind of a big one that they try to use, that, well, we can't tell you how we're spending all the money because you just can't know it. It would be a matter of national security. I think it needs to be pushed.
My question's for Brian Miller. First of all, I've never been to EAD before, and the theme of violence and peace is what brought me here. And I've been directly affected by gun violence in the past, and I definitely see the need to reduce the amount of guns that are on our streets. But I'm a little uncomfortable with some of the wording in some of the asks and reducing, specifically reducing the, limiting the acquisition of guns by person with a documented mental illness. And I think that there isn't really any statistical evidence that anybody with mental illnesses are more violent than anybody else. And I think I'm a little uncomfortable, and I wanted to know why it is that it's in there that we should limit the acquisition of guns by persons that have a violent history and also mental illnesses.
Well, I can't cite any data today, but I will say this, that I think that it's obvious to me at least that that many, if not all, of the mass shootings in this country and there have been dozens of them that aren't publicized, but are typically done by people with some emotional disturbance of some sort. This is a really tricky issue to define who might be violent and who might not, and I understand that. And our hope is in our movement is to actually work with the folks that are experts on mental illness, and to be able and this is a long task, but to be able to more closely identify who might commit a violent act and who are unlikely to commit that act. But I will say this as well. The mental health community, for whatever reason, has not been willing to sit down with us and talk about this. Their theory, and I understand it, is that by identifying certain people who can't get guns, that we're stigmatizing them, and that's understandable. But on the other hand, we're concerned about public safety, and if there are people who can be identified as potentially violent, then I think we should, and frankly, as somebody who works in the field of gun violence, I am perhaps less concerned about people's ability to get guns than, for instance, you may.
I'd like to just add to that. If you look carefully at that statement, it says diagnosed with severe mental illness and demonstrated violent behavior. That's a part of that statement, that they have demonstrated violent behavior. We've also been trying to work with school systems and get some kind of legislation eventually that would help reduce violence or violent tendencies through group counseling and other things with youth. Yeah.
Marge back here, use the microphone.
There's somebody back here with a mic. You need to, I'll call on you. I know you're there.
Yeah, I have a question about some clarity with the ammunition capacity and semi-automatic weapons. Is that pretty much banning or asking the limit of sale of pretty much everything that's not a revolver or a musket loading weapon? Because there are weapons from .22 rifles, all kinds of handguns or anything that has a detachable magazine, but they may not be of large capacity or rapid fire. And I'm curious how broad the request is, and I guess you could go from there.
I think we're really, as I think has been said here, we're looking for people to express their heartfelt views about this and not so much be exactly 10 bullets or 9 bullets or whatever. Legislators need to know that this is an issue that concerns us and that we understand that high-capacity ammunition magazines, frankly, serve no purpose other than to kill a lot of people very quickly, and that as such they are inappropriate for civilian possession. And I will let you know that they are only allowed for civilian possession in the United States, which probably has something to do with the fact that the United States has a rate of gun violence that is many, many times higher than any other developed country. So what we're seeking to do is to make it less likely that a Jared Loeffner or an Adam Lanza can shoot up a school or shoot up a group in a parking lot, because at a certain point they're going to have to change their magazine. The smaller the number of bullets in a magazine, the faster that point occurs, and in almost every case that these mass shooters have been overwhelmed, it's been at the point where they have to change their magazines, and they can be overwhelmed at that point, so we want that to happen.
On the same note of who cannot get guns, I do not want a gun. I'm not an advocate. I know personally a family that was affected by gun. My concern is with mental illness, and I recognize that you mentioned about the severity of the illness. There was mental illness in my family. My grandmother, my mother, all of my brothers and sisters. It's not severe for me because it's under control with medication and the doctors. And I don't want a gun. Certainly. The question is, when you talked about the labeling and so forth, wouldn't that be a bias of sorts, that when they're having to decide whether who is dangerous and who's not, would it be the doctor's decision or recommendation?
It's demonstrated violent behavior. Demonstrated. It's already, yeah, I mean, that's right there.
Over here, Marge.
Yep. Okay.
Back to the Pentagon ask and military spending. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel has announced a reduction of size of forces in the upcoming years. How does that fit into our ask? Should we be supporting that? Should we be pushing it further? Just what's the mix there?
I guess I would welcome input from others, but my sense would be that some of what's being talked about is a shift in forces and saying we need less Army troop presence and shifting to resources and manpower in other directions. And I would say that we sort of don't care where those troops are, where we are pouring our money into the Pentagon budget. We want the shift to happen. And I think, in terms of what Hagel has spoken to and proposed, he has said some important things about reducing the military budget overall, but we also see a situation where the budget ask for this year sort of sticks to the agreed-to caps on the military side, although they skirt it with a couple of fancy mechanisms, and then blows through those caps starting next year. So I think you will hear things about the Army being funded at historic lows, not seen since, I think they're saying World War II, or that's the Army only. That's not all of the military branches, and that reflects a force shift and a strategic shift, not a shift in the broader priorities.
Right. And we have other means of carrying out warfare that don't demand as many people on the ground, or as many soldiers.
Way in the back here, Marge.
Hi. Could we hear a little bit more about the Complex Crises Fund as well as conflict and stabilization operations. That sounds positive. Could we have a little bit more detail on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So Complex Crises Fund has been used, for example, in Kenya, where they had an election last couple of years where a lot of violence happened, so another election was coming up. So they were able to use money from that pot to send in people to do some conflict mapping, kind of use this new conflict framework they've developed, connect with local organizers and local community folks to set up like early warning response systems and do trainings in conflict transformation, basic nonviolent skills. So that's one example, and it's flexible so that they can use it kind of on the go, which is really important. DoD has a huge flexible fund. State does not have much, and we're only talking like $30-40 million, right? Pentagon budget's $600 billion and upwards. So if we get this institutionalized and we keep asking for it to pump up, then we get them exploring different types of civilian expertise, right? Like nonviolent strategic leaders or resistance leaders or unarmed civilian peacekeepers or restorative justice facilitators, et cetera. The second fund, it's actually a bureau, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization. It's a new bureau in the State Department, and they have, a number of countries they work in. They're trying to establish themselves as people that can really have an impact. So they need support from the people within our own U.S. government. Examples: they also worked in Kenya, Syria, Burma, Honduras. But they've started this thing called the Civilian Response Corps, which is intended to be a set of civilian experts who can sort of go on the fly to a conflict zone and kind of defuse the violence. So if we can get that pumped up, that's, long road. That's similar to trying to really transform the kinds of interventions, the kinds of humanitarian interventions we actually do in a civilian, nonviolent way. So they're sort of the cutting edge opportunities, we think.
Okay, back here.
We've got a question right here, Marge.
Yep.
This is for the gun folks, or reducing gun violence folks, I should say, sorry. So among the legislation that you've listed here and the provisions, I'm curious to what extent I've heard in the past that there's problems with funding the investigation and enforcement of our gun laws, since we have some on the books that are good, but they're not effectively enforced. And my understanding is that's because the agencies that are supposed to do that have been sort of culled. Is that included in any of this legislation listed here, or is that something that we should or could be talking about as well?
The collect data on the number of deaths and injuries by guns in the U.S., that's the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, has been severely restricted to what data it can collect and analysis it can do. President Obama has tried to open that up with executive order, but it's something that they collect this data on every other form of illness and disease, but about guns and gun violence. So this is really an important thing because, as I said before, it's really hard to convince a legislator to do something unless you can put numbers in front of them. But ATF, for instance, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, which is the federal enforcer of federal gun laws, has been for years severely restricted. Each year, ATF, the gun lobby seeks to close it down, and the records that they keep, background check records, in this day and age, by law, must be kept on paper. So that there's this massive warehouse in West Virginia that the FBI maintains that is full of paper instead of computers. It's ridiculous, and these are the kind of things that the gun lobby has been able to enforce, and yeah, they should be changed.
Yeah, you've actually raised a very good issue, and it is not in any of these particular things, no.
I hope I'm not speaking too much about the issue of the diagnosis of mental illness, but I just wanted to say as a physician that I think it's just an important conversation to have. And that as a physician, I do not like when I have to report patients for certain illnesses, but there is a precedent for this already. There are certain diagnoses, I can think of 4 right now, that when it's established, and I discussed this with the patient, they are not allowed to drive for a certain period of time, that their car can't be a weapon against other people. And this is, but again, there are certain criteria to be made. And I'm not saying that I know the criteria and that I would establish the criteria for the mental diagnoses, and I think not only for the danger that they do to other people, but the easy conversation for me to have with a patient is, I don't want you to hurt yourself if this were to be part of the provisions. That's how I would look at it as a physician and my patient. And I would never want anything to step in front of their rights, but if this were to be a provision, that's how I would approach it in the room, would be, I don't want you to hurt yourself.
Can I suggest that you talk to folks in the mental health community and seek to get them to discuss this issue, because they have not wanted to talk about it? We'd love to, in our community, we absolutely want to talk about it because we want to be fair about it.
I'd like to have Eli speak to the Youth Promise Act, because that intrigued me, especially when Elisa was talking about monies available in Somalia for youth employment. And I come from a background in Africa where youth employment is tremendously high, so it'd be great to have, if there's an international piece to this, Youth Empowerment Act, I could bring my experience to that conversation.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. So the Youth Promise Act is focused on domestic opportunities. So it's intended to fund evidence-based programs that prevent violence in the U.S. So local communities in U.S. cities. So for example, like the restorative justice program you just heard about, Cure Violence has a violence prevention program in Chicago where they walk the streets and they do interruption. So that's kind of what that's intended for. If you wanted to speak internationally, I mean, I would think.
I was just saying that what Alyssa was referencing this morning was an AFSC program, so and one that is not only not federally funded, we don't take federal funding, but is clouded by that law that she mentioned, HAFA, that so it's the U.S. government needs to be investing in that sort of thing.
But there are examples of the CSO, for sure, funding local programs that deal with youth issues. So like in Belize, they funded a program which they had like 2 trainers in conflict mediation to deal with a big gang issue, and they scaled that up to like 60, 70 trainers, and now they get to work in the city of Belize. And so that was a CSO funded program, so I think you could fit it in there.
Okay, another question down here.
My question is for Brian Miller, relating to the point about collecting data on gun violence. I wonder if you could speak to how Heeding God's Call faces barriers in collecting data after the TR amendment, and how that stops you from your work to protest the gun shops.
Wow, what a great question. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to tell you about something that you're all going to go, can't be that way. But he mentioned the Tiahrt Amendment. It's named after a former congressman from Kansas named Todd Tiahrt. He was a water carrier for the gun lobby for many years. Every year when appropriations are made, there is a rider called the Tiahrt Amendment that is attached to the Department of Justice's appropriations that says that ATF can spend no federal dollars to disseminate any gun trace information. Yeah. ATF is sitting on, they don't want to be sitting on it, believe me. They're sitting on every gun that is traced, which means that in 52 cities, all 52 major and most important cities in the United States, every gun that's recovered from crime is traced back to its original place of purchase and the original purchaser. Except for in just 2 or 3 states that have their own system, New Jersey, California, and I think Massachusetts, that information is sitting in that warehouse that I mentioned before in West Virginia that is unavailable to anyone in the United States. ATF once a year releases aggregate information that says, okay, guns purchased in Pennsylvania account for this amount of guns recovered from crime in New Jersey, and so on and so forth. But none of it identifies who the seller was, who the buyer was, which cities are most important, which gun dealers are selling the most guns that end up in crime, and so on. That information is in that warehouse. We can't get it because of the Tiahrt Amendment. Thank you.
Oh, one there? Okay.
Hi, 2 things. One is I've done a lot of advocacy and been here many times before. It is so important for everybody to stay on task. Tuesday, you can call back, say, remember I was there, and ask whatever else you care about it. But it's critically important to stay on task about violence and these issues. Please do that. Second, in advocacy, I want to be able to go in there and say, this was done really well. I want to have something really positive along with the things I'm asking for. So what can I say that, this has been really good?
Okay, where are you? Right there?
It's a good question.
This isn't exactly an answer specifically related to gun violence or military cuts, because not much good has been done on either of those subjects. However, part of our ask is transfer funds from outsized military spending to human security. And Congress has done some good things on human security. Let me give you an example. And this is something, and this is, by the way, this is an important part of our ask. It's not just what we're against, it's what we're for. And on the domestic side, you can talk about the needs in your community for education, for job creation, for food, and housing, all of those things. And this has, I think, a lot of legs in Congress, because they're hearing from people throughout the United States that we're tired of spending all this money on wars, and we need to meet our needs here. And if you and that has Republicans and Democrats, there are among both parties people that would agree with that. So speaking to those things from your heart, we want to see money spent on these needs. And it's not just our country, but around the world. 20 years ago, there were approximately 12 million children dying a year under 5 years old from poverty-related illness, dying unnecessarily. That figure currently has been cut in half to just a bit over 6 million a year, in spite of the increased population in the last 20 years, in part because the work that the United States has done and Congress has appropriated on humanitarian and poverty-focused foreign assistance, on assistance that feeds the hungry and provides clean water and sanitation, that helps refugees, that helps people in disasters, that provides funding for global AIDS. And you can tell Congress your funding has contributed over the last 20 years to cutting the number of child deaths in half. And thank you for that, but let's not stop here. We're spending way too much on the military. Let's put some more money and save the rest of those 6 million children's lives every year. And let's give some hope to farmers, smallholder and women farmers, and let's feed the hungry and clothe the naked. And I think that's you can tell them, thank you for what you've done. Let's keep going. and also talk about those domestic human needs that you know from your own communities. So that's a partial answer
I think
anyway.
Ara wanted to add to that.
I think on the military budget front and the proportion front, it was a good step that in the last few years, as sequestration was talked about and as other deep cuts were made, that the line was held on those cuts being made equally between military and non-military discretionary programs. They started out on very different footing, with military programs having doubled in scope beforehand, but still there was a lot of pressure to cut more from human needs funding and domestic and international discretionary funds that were non-military funds, and so you can thank them for not making the balance more difficult in that arena. And then the next step is to shift the balance back in the direction of those non-military programs.
Okay, thank you. Next.
I think you can also add the programs that Eli has talked about, Complex Crisis Fund, Bureau of Stabilization Operations, as well as the states where gun legislation has been passed that have changed some of those trends. I think all those are important things to point to. We've got another question over here.
What is it appropriate to mention the law enforcement community? In other words, I know in the town where I live, they've cut the funding and eliminated a police officer position, which obviously means we have fewer professionals to deal with violence and people feeling more like they want to take things into their own hands. Most law enforcement folks I talk to are all for the kinds of things we're saying. And they as professionals absolutely agree that these things and their is it appropriate to say something about that? Because I would think that's a big sort of added weight to the kinds of things we're saying about gun violence.
Can I say something quick? Yeah, I'll let Brian say a little more on this, but just related to that, the Youth Promise Act is really intended to educate communities that what actually tends to prevent violence in communities is civilians building programs. More police normally does not prevent violence. It actually tends to escalate it. So the Youth Promise Act is a response to that particular concern, and I'll let Brian talk about the law enforcement and gun violence.
I'll say first off, yes, law enforcement is typically, they're the ones that face the guns the most. So there's a lot of support, especially among executives, the people that manage other folks who send people out there every day. A lot of support for gun violence prevention measures. I think personally, I think it's important that increase in, but I'll say this, most law enforcement is local. I mean, the vast bulk of it. The feds give some money to for local law enforcement, but not much. And I think that the attention on this particular issue should probably be on your local legislators.
We have more of a comment back here.
I just wanted to say that for the couple of people, I know you had asked about the legislation. There is some legislation around the ATF. It's HR 1728, if you're interested in that, and it's about enforcing the Gun Laws Act, and it's trying to restore the repealing the limitations of the ATF's investigative capabilities. I just wanted to make you aware of that for those of you that were interested in the ATF. HR 1728. It was introduced last year.
Okay, do you want to say something while he's moving? Oh, no. Okay.
Got two questions right up here.
Okay, last year was my first time to this conference. I felt really ignorant going up, talking about the SNAP bill. Okay, but now I'm back a second time. I don't feel as ignorant. However, okay, so I want reduction of Pentagon budgets because the SNAP bill needs to be increased because we have hungry children in our community because the food was cut from the preschool. Is that
That's a connection you can make.
philosophy? Thank
Yep,
you.
that's a connection. That's a good connection to make.
Thanks.
You know, speaking from your heart, speaking from your own experiences.
I was so grateful to hear the question that came up about what we could say that was positive. Because the first time I came was about 6 years ago. And I loved the conference. I felt ignorant. I learned so much. And then we went to lobby. And I actually felt embarrassed by the time we left because of some of the hostility and animosity I sensed being expressed by those in my group. And I'd like to go back to Friday night when John Deere spoke. Many of us were very touched. I was touched by the fact of that unconditional love. And I'm hoping that when we go out on Monday, that we go not seeing our representatives as adversaries, but seeing them as people who have been elected to do good for our country, and to be able to give them that and then speak the truth in love.
Thanks, Michael. My comment is very similar to what my sister just said. I know with National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, my national church, I have people across both aisles, on either aisles of this conversation. And I think it's important for us to go as Christians, to really go in as people of faith with an openness of hospitality, to be able to listen. These are tough, tough, tough issues. And the people we're talking to are in the driver's seat to make these decisions. We have elected them in a democracy, a real democracy. And we have a lot of work to do back home with our churches and local folk if we really want systemic structural change of people who are more aligned with the way we about things. So we have to also, I think, go into this room saying, I am committed to what I'm doing at the local level with my churches to say we care about these issues. So I just want to remind us of who we're representing, who are we reflecting when we go in there, and to really show love and hospitality and work across the aisle. One of the pieces that we do in Indiana that just came from some advocacy with both evangelicals, liberal, everybody together, is really just letting the legislature know we are praying for you. We're praying for you. We're praying for our country, we're praying for our neighborhoods, and all these things that affect all of us. We are Christians, we are praying for you. You are in our worship services back home. We do love you. It's hard, but we do love you, okay? But these are real people with real issues and real families. And I don't mean to preach to everybody because I know everybody knows this, but it's wonderful to go in with an attitude of love and hospitality. You'll be much more received. And maybe when you make that follow-up call, someone may actually listen to you instead of hanging up the phone or putting you on the bottom of the list. So I just want to say, be Christian, be hospitable, and show the love that Christ would show.
I think it's important to mention that later on today we do have the advocacy skills workshops that will really, for those of you for whom doing advocacy is new or you want to brush up on your skills, I think these are really important comments and reminders. But those sessions, look in your programs to make sure that you attend one of those, because those sessions really are tailored toward how do we bring this message to the Hill. Right now, we really are focusing on what is the message that we're bringing to the Hill. So,
yeah, I see one more right in front of the camera back here.
okay. We had one right here.
Oh, one, okay. I think these two might have to be the last two, actually.
Okay. His question was answered.
Oh, okay. It looks like you might.
My husband would love that. This is my first time, and I am so overwhelmed. But I do want to talk just a second about a couple of things that I have been sort of pondering about and praying over, wondering if I am brave enough to get up and even address it. The whole idea about reduction in military spending is a really vague approach. My concern is that reduction will first be targeted to the troops. Is there a legislation out there calling for effective job placement and assimilating back into communities? When our service men and women with families no longer receive a salary. My husband back in the 90s was given an incentive opportunity to opt for an early out. He took it, but gave up his retirement. We have survived sequestration. We have survived the termination of his government position. And I have 3 sons in the United States Air Force, one who anticipates separation in September. They are expecting their second child in August. Also, and this is the hard part for me to say, but I'm just going to say it, I am concerned with the perception this body has regarding those serving our country. We have come a long way in our show of patriotism to our troops since the post-Vietnam conflict. I would hate to see us take steps backward.
I think those are some important comments, and I would add that in our workshop session that is that is upon us, one of the workshops is on some of these issues of how do we, as congregations, welcome those returning from war, not just veterans, but those who have served in war, and it'll deal with some of these issues. Ara?
And I think that's an incredibly important thing to remind folks of. I think there's a reason we talk about Pentagon spending, because there are a lot of elements of Pentagon spending that have nothing to do with taking care of troops. And so the degree to which general salaries have grown and sort of the number of top brass is a big issue. Folks will often point to the degree to which military health care costs have ballooned, and that's the problem. That's not the problem. I mean, that is a problem, but it's a symptom. And so, in a situation where, as we discussed this morning, many young people don't have a lot of options for a good job, for an education, and we have created a system that narrows a lot of folks' options toward the military, and a lot of folks who choose that route, and that's an honorable choice. I think it's very important to be able to separate those things, that to speak about our choice to invest so heavily in the military is not about disrespecting that investment or that commitment. That's very important to us and something that we are careful with in our own messaging and in our hearts.
And I think adding to that, a lot of the things that you're referring to are not in the Pentagon budget. They're in Veterans Affairs and other areas of the budget. And I think most of us try to promote those.
And another important point to maybe have in your pocket is that there is a tiny bit of funding that's been, or there's appropriating language for looking at, what's the term for military conversion?
I don't know, but
there are some folks who are looking at how to convert some of those areas that are very dependent on those industries to other areas. Studies have shown that military spending is one of the least efficient job creators, that investing in transportation and education and other areas generates twice as many jobs. So we need to stop thinking of the military as our main jobs program and start investing in over the longer term in other forms of security and jobs.
Okay.